Welcome. My name is Jacinto Ramos Jr. I'm the president of Fort Worth Independent School District Board of Trustees, president of MASBA, the Mexican American School Board Association, and the chief of governance and leadership at Leadership ISD. As our friends from throughout the state begin to log on, I'd like to provide a brief overview of our time together today. For this conversation, co-sponsored by MASBA, Leadership ISD, and our friends at the Texas Caucus of Black School Board Members, in a moment, I'll introduce the moderator for our panel, who will, in turn, introduce today's panelists. Before that, I'd like to draw your attention to a few details concerning this GoToWebinar platform. If you'd like to raise your hand to be acknowledged to speak, simply press the raise hand button, which looks like a hand with an up arrow. I'll give you a moment to find the raise hand button. If you'd like to try it now, you can practice raising and lowering your hand. Thank you. You can also type your questions in the questions tab. I'll give you a moment to find the questions tab. And as you do so, I'd like to share our words from our organizations. We have had an increase every week in participants, and I'm know that we are gathering as much information as we possibly can during this unprecedented time. And the intent is for us to be able to go back to our boardrooms and our school systems to find the best possible practices that we can to be able to stay focused on student outcomes and get the best possible results. So we've been diversifying the way we handle our panels and our discussions. And so today's no different. What I like to do is now introduce you to our returning moderator, which is our friend from the Board of Trustees in Houston ISD, and also the Vice President of MASBA, who will introduce our guest and walk us through the agenda for today. So please help me in welcoming Trustee Holly Maria Flynn Villaseca.
Hey everybody, welcome. Thank you so much if you are returning. Thank you for setting some time aside with these Monday Lunch and Learns addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and navigating the pandemic as a leadership team with your board and learning from experts that have been in the midst of navigating the pandemic as well. Today we're going to take a little bit of a turn. I also do want to welcome the new folks that have joined us today. Again, we're going to continue these every Monday from 12 to 1 p.m. Central. I know there majority of people are tuning in from Texas, but we also have some people from across the United States, including two of our panelists today. So this week, we're going to be focusing on policy and policy impact in the pandemic. We have two professors that are going to be joining us and are here with us today to talk a little bit more about some policy implications, a little bit about their background and research and why they're working in education, but also what does this mean to us that are making decisions right now? What kind of things should we be considering as far as policy is concerned? And what should we be looking forward to as far as planning for the future? And so first I'd like to welcome Dr. Carrie Sampson, who's tuning in live from Arizona. She is a professor at Arizona State University and has done a lot of important work and research on school boards and the effectiveness of school boards and the inequities and representation of school boards and how they misalign oftentimes with the students that they represent. I'd like to welcome Dr. Carrie Sampson. We would also, and he's having some technical difficulties, we're going to hang on and hope and light the candle here that I have on my table, that Dr. Julian Vasquez, who's tuning in from Kentucky, who is now the Dean of Education at the University of Kentucky College of Education, who is going to be joining us hopefully momentarily. And we're just really excited. Thank you for taking out time from your students and your research to join school board members and administrators from across Texas. So we're going to go ahead and start, Dr. Sampson. Can you give us a little bit more information about your background, why you entered academia, why education, and your research focus?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First, thank you so much, Holly Maria, and the rest of you all for inviting me to participate today. I really am encouraged that you all are doing these webinars during this time. I think you're really ahead of the curve in terms of paving the way for some of these conversations to happen now and hopefully into the future. So you asked about my background, right? My research. So I am from the Southwest, Arizona, Nevada. I come from a working class family. My mother is Chicana. Most of her family is from New Mexico. My father's African American. Most of his family's from Arkansas. And I've kind of landed in this space in terms of education research, policy, leadership, equity, in a very roundabout way. I have a degree in economics. I thought I was going to go into like corporate America, and I ended up realizing quickly that kind of my calling and my commitment to social justice would not allow me to kind of go into that sphere of corporate America. But I think education and my belief that education is one of the cornerstones for really achieving social justice has gotten me to this place. And you know, going into the academy allows me kind of to have the freedom to focus on these issues that are really complex. There's a lot of problems, as we all know, a lot of complexities in education in this current context. And so doing this work in terms of research and trying to connect it to practice and policy, I think is really important. And so I'm really happy and excited to be here today to share with you some of my research, some of my perspectives, both as a researcher, and I'm also a mother scholar. I have two young ones, a 4 and a 7-year-old, who are at home right now, and who I'm trying to juggle all of my full-time work with being now, full-time mom, educator, housekeeper, all these things. And so it's been a really interesting several weeks.
Absolutely. I'm sure many of us on the call can identify juggling being elected officials, managing your day job, being a parent or a caretaker, trying to check on neighbors and other loved ones to make sure that they have what they need during this time. So I know in this house, we're sort of in different corners trying to cohabitate and make the most out of the situation. Is there any piece of research work that you're most proud of? And if so, just maybe talk a little bit about that, why?
Yeah, sure. So I started researching school desegregation, like the history of school desegregation in Southern Nevada, and that led me to my work around school boards. And the question was, at that point in school desegregation cases throughout the United States, school boards were huge in either kind of expanding equity or hindering equity. And so I wanted to understand, what does that look like now? And so I started doing research around how school boards, the role of school boards in addressing policies and practices for English learners. And so in that work, there was a lot of, I guess, less optimistic pieces that I found in that research, right? School boards are up against a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges, both contextually and even, within as board members and within the board and districts that they work in. And so, but one of the most optimistic pieces I wrote and co-authored out of that piece was a piece called "Putting the Public Back in Public Education: Community Advocacy and Educational Leadership Under ESSA." And so there's a lot of issues, I think, around ESSA, but we took it from kind of a glass half full approach and thought about the ways in which community, I don't know, I'm hearing myself echo. Are you hearing me echo? Yeah. Oh, no. I think Julian's talking too. Maybe that, is he?
Does that work?
Hello? Okay, that's better. Yeah. Okay, so in that piece, what we were able to do is kind of take the findings from that work around school boards and look at what were the major factors that helped to push equity forward. And it was community advocacy. In every case, and I looked at 3 school boards in 3 states, all serving majority students of color, low-income students, a lot of English learners. And although the school boards were not necessarily themselves as proactive they did react to community advocacy efforts. And in some of those cases, some of the community advocates who were pushing for equity became school board members. And so that was really an optimistic piece. In that piece, I also offered a lot of concrete recommendations to school board members around how to leverage community advocacy, you know, whether that be, you know, through partnerships, inviting community advocates into the districts and schools, opening up public comment during community school board meetings to really kind of address, not just hear out in a 3-minute, you know, time limit community advocacy concerns, but really how to address that, these concerns and these equity issues within this space. And so, yeah, I think that would be the piece that I'm most proud of.
Thank you so much for sharing. Was that Dr. Vasquez Heilig that I heard momentarily?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Well, I apologize, but I'm in my pajamas, so I can't turn on my webcam. No, I'm just kidding. I have a Mac, and the camera's just not showing up in my privacy settings. It shows Zoom and Teams, but no GoToMeeting. So I hope that it's okay that I can communicate with you this way.
Absolutely. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad you're here. Dr. Sampson just kicked off with a little bit of a background feed to the audience, along with why she entered academia and education and the piece of work that she's most proud of. Would you like to also go ahead and share?
No, I'm glad to. So first, I'm glad to join everyone. Glad to be here. My career actually started at the University of Texas, Austin. So I was there for 8 years. I was tenured there. Then I ended up in California in a chair level role in education leadership. That's my field within education, leadership, and policy. And then now I'm here at Kentucky. The University of Kentucky. We're one of the top 30 ranked public colleges of education. We have about 2,500 students. We train several hundred teachers every year. I got into this work because of my passion for education being the compass of democracy. The work that we do as educators, as school board members, as academics is key, especially now more than ever, in terms of having a vibrant democracy. And so that's what gives me passion. That's what wakes me up in the morning. It's the students in our schools, the students that have been historically underserved, especially students of color, Latinx students, African American students, and other brown and black students are what drives me to work very hard each day to create the future leaders and educators, health educators, STEM educators of the future.
Thank you so much for that introduction. What piece of research are you most proud of and why?
That's a good question. You know, there's a story in there. Coming back from academic conference in Rome, Italy, it was an APAM conference. And at that conference, all the countries around the world, there was ministers of education, politicians, researchers, they were all talking about how great No Child Left Behind was. And that we needed to do No Child Left Behind in every country in the world. This is a true story. And at the time, I was really flummoxed by this because having conducted research in the Valley, in Brownsville, in La Jolla, Donna, Texas, Houston, my career started in the Houston Independent School District in the Research and Accountability Department before I became an academic. I knew that there was real challenges what was happening with high stakes testing and accountability, especially for English language learner students, special education students. And so I really thought that it would be important for us to come up with a new approach to accountability. And you know, Steve Jobs once said that there was no new idea. Most ideas were small ideas borrowed from other good ideas. And so strategic planning wasn't necessarily a new idea, of course. Community engagement and education policy development, multiple measure approaches to assessment, formative and summative, none of those ideas were new, But together in a new idea called community-based accountability, it was a new idea. And so I put together a work group at UT Austin. We started to work on this idea, put together a summary sheet, 2012, 2013. Well, I gave that information to Linda Darling Hammond, who was my advisor at Stanford. And she gave that to her connections in the California legislature, and community-based accountability became the law for the entire state of California. They have LCAPs, the strategic plans that districts and schools develop together with communities as an alternative bottom-up approach to accountability post NCLB. Texas started to adopt some of this work with the High Performance Coalition about 5 or 6 years ago, and now community-based accountability is in pilot stages across the state. So I think one person can make a difference. I think it's important for us to think about education reform in community engaged, community relevant, community driven ways. I don't think education reform has to be about privatization and private management of our education system. And so that's probably the work I'm most proud of is how do we implement education policies that are community-based, community-relevant, community-engaged.
Thank you so much. So obviously, there's some overlap between some of the findings in Dr. Sampson's research and some of the things that you've worked on as well, Dr. Heilig, which is really we cannot leave out the community. And anything that we're considering, we need to engage in a real way, more than a hearing of citizens kind of thing. And out of the research too, there has been real change statewide, and I am familiar with some of the pilot work here in Texas, and it's exciting. I think that it does need to be scaled up personally. So why don't we go ahead and pivot a little bit now that we're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic? What types of policies and regulations would be the most impactful to our students and communities given the pandemic?
Well, I think the first thing, let me go first and then I'll hand it over to Carrie. Good to talk with you, Carrie, by the way. Known
Yes,
Carrie
you
for
too.
what, a decade, maybe longer.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So I think one of the first things that we've got to be concerned about is what's going to happen with school finance in Texas and other places. As we saw with the last recession, education was the first thing cut. $6-7 billion were cut from the budget in Texas. We saw this in other states too, and not until only recently did Texas come to pre-recession levels in terms of funding. And I don't even know if they made it all the way there if you adjust for inflation. So I think one of the big challenges for us in the coming year is what's going to happen with school finance. A lot of people aren't talking about that because education is often the first thing cut. So I think that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about. We need to be talking with policymakers about, with communities about. We do not want the brunt of what's happening financially to fall on the shoulders of our children. I think another thing, they cut the virus task force a couple of years ago, and then now more than ever, we need a virus task force. There were some districts that thought that online learning, online pedagogy, and focusing on that work, they kind of stepped back that work over the last couple of years because we were so focused on in-person delivery of education. So I think instructional design, I think how we help teachers deliver curriculum and pedagogy in these alternative modes, and how we are prepared for these types of eventualities. The faculty that are health professionals here, and I'm just being frank with you right now, from the med school and the pharmacy school are saying that this is not a 1 month thing. This is a 1 to 2 year cycle on and off with COVID-19. So this is something that we need to prepare for the long term. I understand that we've all been locked in our houses for 6 weeks and we're itching to go, but none of the circumstances have really changed. So we need to be prepared not only at the higher education level, but at the K-12 level to deliver education in alternative formats.
Julian, it's good to be on here with you. It's an honor. And, a lot of my work has built off of your work. And so I appreciate the opportunity to think about this with you. And yeah, I think you make a great point. School finances, I mean, it's going to be devastating for many schools to have to deal with what's happening, what's going to happen in terms of budget cuts. And so being, vigilant about, getting committed to politics and kind of pushing forward an agenda that will, fight back against some of these cuts in education is key. I think, another thing is to really think about ways to kind of reimagine how we co-create opportunities with families and communities in terms of education. So myself and 4 other mothers of color were all, in the academy, researchers here in Arizona at ASU. Our kids go to schools across the valley right now. Some in charter schools, some in traditional and public, district schools. And one of the things that we've had in common, I mean, it's been a varied experience what our kids have received. Some of them are getting online every day, with tons of assignments. Their emails are being flooded, and we're talking 6, 7-year-olds, with X assignment and this assignment. Others are getting online, once a week. But one of the things that we have had in common is that none of the educators in our schools, school leaders, teachers, have reached out to us to see how are things going outside of, do you have technology? Do you have food? So there's that basic, right? Like, we want to make sure all kids have access and technology and meals. And I think a lot of schools have done a really good job of that. But in terms of really checking in with families and finding out, how are you doing? How are you managing this? What's going on? How do we co-create a curriculum that is humanizing, that is responsive to your needs, to what's happening right now? Because, I think this is before the pandemic. Schooling couldn't be nothing without families, and now it certainly can be nothing without families. And so I think really thinking about policies and practices that will kind of address the need to really engage our families and our communities for right now, the short term, of course. And, I agree that this is going to be longer than a month. How do we continue this? And hopefully, something good can come out of this, because even when we're past this, hopefully these types of partnerships, and this will just become the norm, that we've engaged our families and our communities so much that they're really co-creating and co-designing these, humanizing curricular opportunities and learning spaces for our kids. And yeah, I think partnering, with higher education institutions to figure out the online pieces is an opportunity that a lot of districts can kind of go after. I know that's something we've been at ASU. We have an extensive online team, and we've been doing online learning for a long time. And so, what can we share? How do we collaborate with our K through 12 partners to, build their capacity during this time is important.
Thank you so much for the dialogue on that front. Do either of you recommend taking on or scaling up initiatives outside of the health, safety, and continued learning piece right now? Why or why not?
Let me say one more thing on the last question. We're talking about scaling up. So let me tie both of these questions together. One of the other areas of my research is school choice, market-based school choice specifically. So charter schools and vouchers. So you have the U.S. Department of Education, Secretary Betsy DeVos, suggesting that states could get extra monies if they do charter schools or vouchers, more vouchers. When times get tough, a lot of people like Starbucks, and people line up for Starbucks. But when times get tough, families have to cut their budgets. They have to be more efficient with their budgets. And what's been happening with charter schools and vouchers is that we have been funding 2 separate systems of education, even 3, because with vouchers you're funding the private schools. With charter schools, you're funding a separate set of privately managed schools. And so even though California has been, for example, has been increasing their funding quite a bit over the years, because they're funding two separate systems in California, 2 separate systems in Texas, and in some states you've got 3 where you have vouchers. It's a real inefficient use of our funds. And so when we're talking about scaling up, there are folks out there talking about scaling up school choice. But the question is, can we actually afford to scale up school choice right now? Because with budget cuts, can we really afford to fund 2 systems of education, or even 3 in some states? I think that's an important question we need to ask our policymakers. We need to ask our communities. Can we really afford to fund 2 or 3 separate systems of education?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you know, I think in addition to that, yeah, I think it's important to consider the health, safety, and concerns of our kids right now, and our families and our communities. I think, you know, everyone's working under limited capacity, you know, in the current situation. And at the same time, you know, what my research on school boards has shown is that school boards tend to be, I think, and I said this, reactive. Reacting to policy, you know, federal policies, reacting to state policies, reacting to, you know, community advocacy, whether that is good or bad. Yeah, I think, you know, but how can school boards be, and superintendents and district leaders be proactive in this case? And I think it's going to take thinking about not just continuing with the same initiatives or, you know, that you all were doing, but, you know, thinking about what is it going to look like next year, the year after, you know, 5 years from now, and how do we proactively address equity, prioritize equity, and ensure that, you know, and think about this differently. I mean, yeah, and I think that's going to be contextual and depend on everyone's context. And politics is a big piece of that. I mean, you know, being able to garner the support in a virtual space that we have right now, you know, garner, you know, advocacy at every level to make sure that, you know, we don't harm our kids and our families' opportunities. So, I mean, yeah, I think scaling up is just going to be, I mean, I don't know that scaling up is going to be a priority or should be a priority, but really proactively planning and being engaged in that now is, I think, going to be really important.
Yeah, and I think we have to be careful that on the other side of this crisis, that we haven't exacerbated inequities. Before this crisis, having iPads at home, having high-speed internet, those things were luxuries for many people. But now, having access to that technology and the internet is key to the education of your children. So in my area, Comcast has stepped up, and some other providers to provide internet for the education of students for a certain time period. UK was criticized widely last fall for providing iPads to every single student. There was a lot of criticism of that. But now those iPads are the key to the education and the communication with our students. And I'm not suggesting that districts go out and buy iPads. You know, LA Unified took a lot of heat for that 4, 5, 6 years ago. But what I am suggesting is that we think very carefully about how the current mode of learning, how that can potentially exacerbate inequalities, and how we grow the parts of what we do to address those ongoing challenges.
Great points. Talking about just your research in this conversation right now on high stakes accountability, segregation in schools, lack of representation, all things that focus on systemic inequities. What can we do to be stronger, more resilient, and focused on equity, given the constraints, the many unknowns, and the national rhetoric on public education?
I think the first thing is, I'm just going to be really straight with folks right now. School boards, especially in large city districts, look a lot different than they looked 20 years ago. I'm going to tell you that the school board, for example, of Houston ISD looks very different than the school board as it was when I was an employee of the district back in 1999. And so I think that's one of the keys is we need to make sure that we are electing school board members that are community engaged and community driven. And we have to hold each other accountable for those decisions. When we're in positions of leadership in higher education or K-12, that we uphold those values, even though sometimes there's going to be a political cost to making those difficult decisions. So I think that's one thing that we need to keep our eye on. And we also have to be making decisions about who it is. I'm sorry, they're building a monstrosity of a house next door to me and they hammer and saw all day. So I'll try to make this quick. And so we also, I think, need to make sure that we select superintendents, and this is key. We need to select superintendents that have a different set of abilities, that have abilities to build consensus within communities instead of simply ignore the voices of communities. And that takes a different kind of leadership. Instead of an autocratic leadership style, we need to select superintendents, principals, and other district leaders and peers that we ally ourselves with on school boards that are community engaged and community driven, because we're so disappointed when the superintendents and our colleagues don't end up being interested in things that we care about. But we didn't use the right criteria to choose those allies, those principals, and those superintendents in the first place. So I think we need to change how we're thinking about what kind of leaders we need in this era.
Yeah. I mean, and to build off that, I mean, some of my work suggests that, we create some pipelines for school board membership. Can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. School board members who are representative of their communities, more Black and Brown school board members, and of course, community engaged, those school board members who have equity as a priority, I think is super important. But what we run into is, one, who has the capacity to be a school board member these days? When, being on a school board, particularly these large, urban school boards, I mean, it's super time intensive. In my work, I looked at hundreds and hundreds of meetings, hours and hours long. A school board member, I mean, it's tireless work. It's often thankless work. Very few people, vote, all these things. And it's a lot of times voluntary, so who has the capacity to do that? I think thinking more broadly about, either paying school board members, really like supporting, people who are interested in running for school board, getting more folks that are, mothers of color, who come from working class communities, who understand and have experienced and have lived some of these inequities. I think it's super important to have those voices at the table. And at this point, the way school boards operate, I mean, it's largely people who, are super privileged, retired, a lot of real estate agents. I mean, there's have flexibility in their schedule to do that type of work. And so if we really want to, bring more voices to the table and bring more voices of people who are experiencing inequities, you got to think about how to, make it actually, possible. And right now it's not. And so, I think that is some long-term, like, how do you, expand this pipeline? How do we think about pulling these people to the table, and maybe it is a matter of at this point, developing kind of councils and advisory spaces, to really formalize some community engagement opportunities to kind of get at and what are the real issues that families and communities are dealing with, to garner support for things down the road in terms of equity, etc.
And I also think one other thing is my mother always told me, show me who your friends are and I'll show you who you are. And so I think it's very careful. We have to be careful about the coalitions that we build, and who it is that we trust and who it is that we're empowered by. So I think we also need to, how do we remake that coalition of the 1960s and the 1970s between teachers and academics and the civil rights movement and squeaky wheel parents and other neighborhood associations and organizations? I think it's key now more than ever that we find ways to make those coalitions happen, because the inequities in our schools are persisting. They're persisting for brown boys and black boys and brown girls and black girls, and so communities are craving alternatives. And so I think it's important for us to think about how we work together as coalitions, community coalitions, for innovative ideas. I think that's why the privatization of education has risen to its prominence over the last 20 or 30 years. It's because parents are searching for innovative alternatives. But like you see in Miami-Dade, those alternatives can happen within the district. That innovation can come from the district. You see, Houston has done that over the years with magnets. You see that with small school movements in the past and in New York City. And so that's the keys. We got to create the coalitions, the community-based coalitions, to make innovation happen for parents in a democratically governed way, a democratically based way.
Thank you so much. We're going to have one more question before we open it up to Q&A. So to all participants that are online right now, get your questions queued up in the chat and be prepared to raise your hand, because this is the last question from our panelists that I'm going to be asking. We're going to turn it over to the audience for your opportunity to ask questions of our panelists today. All right, what should board members and administrators not lose sight of as we navigate the pandemic?
So I think one of the things that we have to do better is telling the stories of our schools, of our students, of our families, of our educators. I don't think we can lose sight of that. I think there's often so much negativity around public education, and quote unquote achievement gaps, etc. But I think that we as educators, and it's not just K-12, it's higher ed too. Teacher education programs have been under attack for about the last 10 years. And that's really hurt our enrollments, which is related to the teacher shortages, because there has been these ongoing critiques of educators. So I think it's important not only for K-12 and higher ed to think about how we tell our story better and how we tell our story to different communities. And if we don't know how to do that, how do we work with somebody that can tell our story better to the African American community? How do we work with folks that can tell our story to the Latinx community better? I think that's key. I think culturally as educators, we're not really supposed to talk about what we do. Folks are just supposed to magically find out. So, but I think we need to articulate with social media, new media, traditional media, all just an ecology of communication, so that we can tell the stories of public education. We can't stop doing that, even though there really is a crisis around us.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. And I'm going to just kind of repeat what I said in terms of the importance of partnering with families, hearing families. My daughter is 7. She's in 2nd grade. They have like this 10 a.m. meet time every day on Google Hangout. And I've been like, I've had to kind of like push her every day. She doesn't want to go on it. She doesn't want to do it. It's not very, and I'm overhearing now what's happening every day in this class, this virtual class. And I have to say, unfortunately, it's pretty disappointing. Some of the things I'm hearing the teachers say, the interactions are just not validating. And the one thing that she got that excited her the most, there's two things. One was her former teacher from last year. They were supposed to have a lunch before the pandemic happened. And it couldn't happen because schools closed. And so her teacher reached out to us and said, can we do a virtual lunch? You know, can I do one with a virtual lunch with Rose? And we're like, yeah, you know, and it was like the most exciting thing she had done, you know, in that 2-week period, was to have a virtual lunch with her teacher for 30 minutes in which she sat around with the laptop, you know, her little Chromebook, showing the teacher everything, you know, that she's been doing and all the stuff in her room and all these things, right? And it's just a matter of, I think, that relationship, being able to sit down and really like feel validated and have time to, you know, just connect with this teacher was super important. And then you know, right when this pandemic happened, this a woman, a former social studies teacher out of Sacramento, put together this thing called Teach-In for Revolutionary Minds. It's a Black-centered social studies curriculum. And she's been offering it donation-based on Tuesday and Thursday for 90 minutes. And Rose, I got her involved right away, and Rose has been super engaged in that ever for the last 6 weeks. And it's I'm not forcing her to do it. I'm not pushing, you know, like this is something that she's super, and I asked her, why are you so excited about that and not about, you know, your class, like getting on every day for your class and seeing your friends? And she's like, and these are people she doesn't even know, but it's other Black and brown kids, and she's learning about essentially Black history. And she said, well, because I get to learn about Black history, and I don't usually get to learn about Black history. And so it's really exciting. And the teacher's, you know, very nice, like she validates them in all these conversations. And so, you know, and I think about, can this happen in a virtual space? It can. And is it happening? I don't know. And so how do we, you know, I think prioritize, how can board members, district level leaders really prioritize educators making space, and instead of spending all this time, you know, putting together prepackaged worksheets or videos, you know, how do they make time and make space to connect with our students and our families in a way that actually, you know, really matters, I think is really important. And in some districts in Arizona, I've heard that district leaders and principals are telling teachers not to contact the parents, you know, not to reach out to them, that they'll do it, you know, and so that, you know, obviously, you know, creates some barriers there. And so in what ways do you open up that, you know, through policy and practice?
Can I dovetail with that too? I just love what Carrie said. So I think for those of you that are in Texas are probably really aware of already of the fact that you had a Latinx studies course in Houston that passed the Texas board last year. I was able to do a tiny bit of work on that behind the scenes. And then this year we had a Black history course pass. My understanding is that this is the only Black history course in the nation. I think there are some ethnic studies courses in Oregon and one other state, Connecticut or something like that. But there's a real opportunity here, and I think Carrie picked up on this. You know, the latest research out of Stanford shows that kids feel more engaged in school, especially kids of color, when they learn about the history of their ancestors, and they do better. And white kids actually improve their critical thinking when they have ethnic studies. So if there's an opportunity here, especially in Texas, it's to offer these courses, the courses that Houston has been offering, the course that Dallas has been offering. There's a real opportunity here to improve your graduation rates, decrease your dropout rates. That's what all the research says on these types of courses, because kids get fired up to learn about the things that their ancestors did. So I think in terms of growing and opportunity, I think there's one opportunity there too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your talking points and discussion. It's given us a lot to consider as we move forward and, you know, with what we have going on in our districts. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the audience. We have a hand raised by initials JEC. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself. We have to unmute you, and then you unmute yourself.
Sorry, I didn't. I was on a treadmill and couldn't type in Juan Eduardo Cabrera, so I put JEC. Holly, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining us, Superintendent Carrie.
I couldn't wait to say hi to my old friend Julian. He and I go back a long way, and I missed him. We lost touch when he left Austin. So, Julian, how are you, Doc?
Yeah, great to hear from you again.
Yeah, we got to get together after this call. I reached out to Victor to get your cell. I want
Absolutely.
right on this talk. I want to talk about males of color. You know, we started that together 7 years ago here in El Paso, and now I think more than ever, this is going to be something we need to sort of restart post-COVID, if you will. Maybe do another focus. I think it's related to what we're chatting about. So many good topics on this. I think you guys did a great job, Dr. Simpson and Dr. Vasquez. I want to talk to you specifically about the virtual aspect of it, Julian, and the the three systems. I love that approach. I think there are a number of ways we can combat it. But what I've learned, and I've worked, I know as hard as anyone in the country at this, because I've visited with the largest school districts in the country on a regular basis. And even with my technology background, I spent 15 years as a technology attorney, it's still, I think what we took for granted, or at least I took for granted, is all of the contextual clues and knowledge you gain about your kids just seeing them or not seeing them every day, right? And even if we could make virtual work attendance financially, and I know because I've researched this for the last 3 years with a number of the virtuals around the country, the largest, I do think there's a place for that in today's global society and technology-driven school districts, technology-driven economy. But I just don't think it's good for the vast majority of our kids, and certainly not for our kids of poverty and kids that don't come with the ability to build the social emotional connections and vocabulary at home. Those are the ones that will suffer greatest with virtual. So I'm happy to work with you and others across the country to make sure that we, kind of step on that as hard as we can.
Well, I'm with you on that. I don't think virtual should be our main mode of education. But I do think that we've got to have contingency plans to do this kind of work. Just as an editorial comment, my understanding is that there's more than 200 kinds of coronaviruses. So while we
Wow.
talk about this as a once in a 100-year virus, there's this could happen again in 3 years with a different virus. So I just think we need to have contingency plans, because I mean, you see on Twitter folks saying, well, my kid has spent an hour with his teacher every day for the last 6 weeks. That's just not sustainable. So I think that we just got to have some backup strategic plans for this eventuality, in future times.
No, just to be clear, I don't support full-time virtual, but we are, for example, here I know in El Paso, we're working on what we call rolling closures, micro closures, a 24-month game plan for opening partial buildings, closing one school, closing 10, closing the district. We don't think that the cities will go back to this closure again. So we're planning, I've got like 12 different groups working on the strategies for how we're going to handle it. We started that about a month ago. So we'll be well prepared for 2 years, but I still just want that virtual to be a Band-Aid, if you will, to get us through this. And we find a way, like, for example, even now, I started a subcommittee for the commissioner here with 3 school districts to start partial reentry of our schools now with at-risk and SPED kids only. So in other words, we take, let's say a building holds 500 people. We might let 75 people in the building, 6-to-1 teacher-student ratio, keep the distancing, but already start helping those students that we know least benefit from virtual, right? So those are the kinds of things I think we need to do now. I'm calling this my academic regression team, which is essentially summer slides started in mid-March. So this is an emergency we have to get after right now. And I think we should do that around the entire country.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Juan, for joining us today and for the question and your leadership and doing some of these. I mean, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. You were on a panel. We really do appreciate your leadership, your thoughtfulness, and taking time to come and share what's going on in El Paso for our board members and administrators here on these calls. And I know that you're involved in other task force, like you said, across the state, and really engaging in dialogue and creating pathways to be able to navigate this in the best way possible. We have a question from A-Leaf ISD here in the Houston area, trustee Natasha Butler from the chat. Natasha, do you want to say your question, or I can read it here? I'll go ahead and read it. All right. We talk a lot about special populations as it relates to equity policy. My concern is that given this pandemic, what about the students that are in JJAEP, DAEP, and mental facilities? Do you have any thoughts about addressing these very vulnerable populations?
Wow. No, I think that's tough. I think, once we've gotten to those situations, there are a lot of things that are broken. And, kids, we often talk about how the poverty variable is a statistical predictor of a test score variable. And it's not that it's what that variable represents, the instability in those kids' lives. So I think the first thing we've got to think about is how do we avoid kids in those situations? And I think restorative practices is one of those ways, whether it be youth courts and there's many other practices. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be said is, Texas, I'm just being frank right now, has a history of punitive discipline. And it had been ingrained in the culture. And so we've got to think about how we can be more restorative in our approaches. In terms of how to address the kids in those situations, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. No one has asked that question. I don't think policymakers are asking that question. We know, for example, that incarcerated individuals they're showing thousands of cases of COVID-19 because of the close proximity within which those folks are. So I don't know. Maybe this is me talking on my feet here. So maybe we think about programs similar to what you see with the early releases of inmates out of jails and prisons. The society has just taken a different tact on some of these things because of the special circumstances. So maybe we think about special circumstances for these kids in this environment, just as we are using those special circumstances with the adult population. What those special circumstances look like, I'm not sure. I think you should talk with your local state rep and state senators. But I think asking for special circumstances for kids in those situations would be the right thing to do and could be negotiated.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be important to work. I mean, I know here, I'm sure in Texas, everyone's kind of getting together with social workers, mental health workers, educators, trying to figure out these and navigate these problems and make sure that we're prioritizing these kids in all extremes. I know I have a friend who runs mental health, homes, facilities, but they're really, homes. And so how do you reach out and make sure that you're in connection and collaborating and partnering with folks who are running these spaces, and building whatever you need to within these types of facilities. It probably looks different all over, but hopefully those conversations are happening, or if not, they need to be happening across the board.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to have one more question come in. It's from trustee Linda Griffin from Garland ISD in the Dallas Metroplex area. She wants to know more about community engagement for African American communities. If each of you could just take 30 seconds or so to respond to that before we close out.
So one of the roles that I held in California was education chair of the California NAACP for the state. And this is what we were really focused on. We were thinking about what we called community-based education reform. How do we get communities involved? And this is difficult work because getting good information to communities and building consensus, that takes special kinds of leaders, special kind of school board members, special types of superintendents to have those skills. And that's what I was talking about earlier, where we needed to prioritize leaders that have those kinds of skill sets. So I think introducing a community-based vision and then working in our networks and within our coalitions to make those visions happen, and putting pressure on policymakers from state reps to senators to governors on up the chain to make that vision happen. So I think that is the key piece. And if you want more clarification, feel free to tweet at me, Professor JVH, Professor JVH. I also have a blog, Cloaking Inequity, that I started when I was in Texas back in 2012. Million readers in more than 200 countries. I talk extensively about how we do community-based reform by engaging with communities, specifically African-American communities. So I'd welcome that discussion on Twitter or on the blog, and let us be a resource to you. I think it's very important that academics and K-12 and civil rights and other stakeholder organizations, we have to recreate those coalitions that we saw 30, 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And, I think there's a lot of anti-Blackness in schools. In Arizona, it's been happening for a long time, but, out of that anti-Blackness, really explicit racism that's happening in schools, they formed a lot of mothers came together to form the Black Mothers Forum. And they coalesced with NAACP, the Alliance of Black Educators, and they use school board meetings. So this is kind of one of the places that I studied, looking at the strategies they used within school board meetings to push school board members, district leaders to address some of these inequities, because otherwise they probably would have just kind of ignored it to some extent, that this was happening. And so they've gone from district to district, engaging, mostly mothers, and other mothers and grandmothers and aunties and cousins, but these Black women, and they've, I've come together with them as well, myself, a couple other scholars, and we've become part of this, the Arizona Alliance of Black Educators, and pushing this forward, really trying to make this a priority, and address anti-Blackness in schools and districts throughout the state. And so I think, like Julian said, it's going to take a lot of this coalition building to get communities engaged, to feel like there's something, that we can actually move towards more equity for our kids. And so, yeah, I've seen it, and I think school boards and school board meetings are an ideal space. What that looks like in a virtual space. I'm wondering how school boards are opening up public comment now, in these virtual spaces. And I think that's another thing that, consider. How are you engaging communities in your school board meetings now? Could be an opportunity.
And let me say one last final thing, because I know, which is that it's important that we have leaders that can create these coalitions, Black, brown coalitions, etc. You're looking at two leaders on this screen right now that have done this in Austin, have done this in Houston. We've got to have these interracial coalitions to make this work happen for our children and their families.
Tremendous. Any last words, Trustee Flynn-Villaseca?
Just a huge thank you for joining us today again. I know both of you really did take time out of your busy schedules to impart lots of important information with policymakers, trustees, administrators here on this call. We can't thank you enough for your lifelong dedication to education, to addressing inequities in education, and making for a better, stronger, and resilient ed system for our community. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's great to be reacquainted, guys. Thank you so much. We'll be on the lookout for more research and tweets and books and articles. And thank you again. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Trustee Flynn-Villaseca. This is Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of MASBA. Before we close out, we want to remind our listeners that next Monday at noon, we'll have Understanding Students' Pandemic Perspectives, a student panel modeling authentic conversation. Join us for an honest, in-depth conversation with students on their experiences of this COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be sharing research and tools for better engaging students in authentic conversations. Our moderators will be Trustee Carla Guadalupe Arcia of Dallas ISD and Jono Oberly of Leadership ISD. We hope you'll join us next Monday. And Ty G. Jones, Trustee of the Lancaster ISD, will close us out. Trustee Jones.
All right, thank you guys very much for participating. I gained a lot of insight. Trustees, we have to be more proactive instead of reactive. Dr. Sampson, I'd love you to share your researches. We can begin to comb through that and make better decisions to influence the lives of our students. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you all. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Thank you so much.